everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We'll be introducing you to the Climate Bonds Bioenergy criteria developed for the Climate Bond Standards and Certification Scheme. Kadir, Standards Manager, and Lily Dye, Senior Research Analyst at Climate Bonds Initiative, are today to talk you through these criteria. But before we begin, I'd like to first go over some basic housekeeping. This webinar will run for 1 hour. We have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You can questions at any point during the webinar by using the Q&A panel at the top right-hand corner in the webinar platform. If phoning in, your questions by email them to lily@climatebonds.net. That is LILY@climatebonds.net. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to participants of the webinar and on our YouTube channel shortly. And now over to Jala to kick us off.
Thank you, Sergio. All right, thanks everyone again for joining us today. I'll just get us started with an introduction on the Climate Bonds Initiative and what we do. So we are an investor-focused not-for-profit, and we work to mobilize the debt capital markets looking for climate solutions. Our organization has 3 work streams that work to sort of achieve these goals. So one of the first work stream is an outreach to the market, and we do that through our policy programs. So we develop policy models and we provide government advice. We work with emerging markets such as in China and Brazil to promote efforts to grow issuance in this market. And then we support and research green innovations in this space, such as in securitization, covered funds, Islamic finance, and others. That's our policy arm of our initiative. The second work stream is market data and analysis, and this is basically a database that we put together on green bonds, and it feeds into the MSCI and Barclays and the Standard & Poor's indices. And we also produce a state of the market report, which is commissioned by HSBC, and that goes through the green bond issuances every year. And then we have regional and thematic focused reports, for example, for China and for Canada and for other places where the market is growing rapidly and there's interesting changes. And then finally, we have the Climate Bond Standards and Certification Scheme, and that is basically focused on developing definitions for investors and guidelines for bond issuers. So it helps to define green and directs the market and signals the market to green investments in infrastructure. And then we provide assurance through a certification scheme, and I'll talk more about that in the next few slides. So this figure here that you're seeing shows the growth in the green bond market, and as you can see, there's been significant growth over the several past years. In 2017 alone, the total green bond issuance reached 155.5 billion USD. And you can see that the growth has been exponential over the years. So there was a 78% growth from 2016 to 2017 and included 37 countries from all continents. And this included 239 issuers, and 146 of those were new. And the largest bond, single green bond, was valued at 10.7 billion. There's been significant growth in this market, and the proceeds of green bonds basically go to green projects. There's often an external review, and annual reporting is required. So what you're seeing here, this chart is actually showing the overall green bond space, and within that there are labeled green bonds as well as CBI certified green bonds. So this is all kinds with certification and without, but just showing that this is the growth in this space. And then we've seen investor diversification as well as issuer diversification. And as you can see, there's been a lot of growth in asset-backed securities. There's been an emergence of sovereign bonds. So there's changes happening in terms of where issuances are coming from and what investors are looking for. So our CBI, Climate Bonds Initiative, we have a climate bond standard and certification scheme. So some of those bonds that you saw in the last figure are certified through our scheme. So the climate bond standard basically functions like a fair trade-like labeling scheme for bonds. It's designed to be a screening tool for investors and for issuers, and it helps them to prioritize investments that do address climate change. And then within the standard, we have two parts. So first is an overarching standard. It details the management process and the reporting processes. And then we go further into detail through our sector criteria. And in these sector criteria, we detail the requirements that assets must meet to be eligible for certification, and look at a number of various sectors. And I think the important thing to note here is that our criteria are designed to support a transition to a 2-degree pathway in line with the Paris Agreement goals. So we recognize that small improvements will not be sufficient to meet those targets, and the international community must take large step changes to these targets. So sector criteria are rooted in trajectories, emission trajectories that are consistent with a rapid decarbonization pathway. And they also address adaptation and resilience. Getting a bond certified is a relatively simple process with various steps that you have to take. So the first step is to prepare the bond, and that entails identifying assets that meet the criteria. So understanding our criteria and then identifying assets within a portfolio that would meet those criteria. And creating a green bond framework, which sets out how the proceeds would be used. So that first step is the preparation. And the second step is to engage a verifier. Climate Bonds has a list of approved verifiers that can be used, and those are all listed on our website. Then the issuer would provide the verifier with relevant information, and then the verifier prepares a report that is submitted to the Climate Bond Standard, to the Climate Bonds Initiative. We review the verifier report and give a decision on whether that meets the criteria, and the bond can then be issued with a certified climate bond mark. Once the bond is issued, we have a post-issuance process. Within 12 months of the issuance, we require verifiers post-issuance report, and that just verifies that the intended use of proceeds are still valid. And then annually require reporting as well. It's a simple report, but it's required each year, just ensure that the assets within the bond are still meeting the requirements. So climate bonds taxonomy is what the Climate Bonds has developed is, you can see here the different sectors that we address through our taxonomy and through our sectoral criteria. So in this figure that you see, you can see the little check mark, which is our Climate Bond certified label. And so where you see those are criteria that we already have developed. And we see the light orange, those are ones that are in development. And the light blue ones are ones that we plan on begin launching and commencing in the near future. So we have criteria for solar, wind, geothermal, rail, transport, mass transit, bus rapid transit, and we have low carbon buildings, which are available for certification, and water infrastructure. So as you can see today, we'll be talking about bioenergy, which is at its public consultation phase, and we will be discussing the details of that criteria. Sector criteria developed through a process. And I'd just like to quickly summarize what that process is. So we begin with doing background research and recruiting members for a technical working group. And the technical working group really is the key to our development of criteria, because it brings in experts from the sector that we're looking at, and uses a sort of consensus building and scientific process to develop these criteria. So after the preparation phase, we have the meetings of the technical working group, and these are monthly meetings where we discuss the issues and draft scientifically robust eligibility criteria. And it can take 6 months to more than a year, depending on the complexity of the sector that we're dealing with. And then we also, at the same time, go to industry working group members. So we develop a group comprised of issuers, investors, and people from the industry that are interested in contributing to this process and collaborating with us. And we also provide the sector criteria with a sort of pragmatic approach, so we can understand how the scientific criteria meet with the practical requirements and issuer requirements in the market. So it's to blend an approach of scientifically robust and at the same time being something that is practical and achievable by the industry. So those are also meetings that are held on a monthly basis. Then once the draft criteria are ready, we go to public consultation, where we receive feedback from the public and we refine our criteria to meet those comments. And the last step in this process then is to submit to our board, our climate standards board, and once we get approval, we release that to the market and issuers are able to certify against that criteria. So for bioenergy criteria, we had a working group with several members, and you can see the full list on our website. But the logo here are some of the members that we had. We had M&G Investments, Utrecht University, Westar. So I'll go through the entire list here, but please feel free to visit the website and get more details of kind of people that were involved in both of our technical and industry working groups. That gives a good background and introduction, and I'm going to pass over to my colleague Lily to go to the details on the bioenergy criteria.
So next I will go through with you the details of the requirements under our bioenergy criteria. So as we all know, an expanded role of bioenergy is required for the transition to a low-carbon economy and lower greenhouse gas alternative to fossil fuel-based energy. So bioenergy plays an important role in decarbonizing electricity, heating and cooling and transport sector. So that's why our bioenergy criteria will cover facilities producing biofuel and biomass and energy generation facilities using biofuel biomass, and also dedicated supporting infrastructure, which you can see from this table. So let me just make it bigger. So you can from this table, the facility producing biofuel and biomass, such as fuel preparation process facilities, pre-treatment facilities, and refinery facilities. Energy production facilities, including heating, cooling, electricity, and cogeneration. But that traditional biomass assets or projects such as cooking stove is not included in the scope because the low energy efficiency and the pollution coming from the traditional biomass process, and supporting infrastructure including dedicated transmission line from eligible bioenergy facilities to the main grid. So let's take a look at the overall of our requirements. So our criteria include two parts. The first one is a mitigation requirement. This requirement is to make sure bioenergy assets and projects can deliver sufficient greenhouse gas emission reduction. The second requirement is about adaptation and resilience. This is also an important part of the low carbon economy. So this requirement is to make sure the bioenergy facilities themselves are resilient to the future climate change and are not lead to negative impacts on the surrounding ecosystem to future climate change. So next, we can take a close look at the mitigation requirements. So people might think that energy assets project, they are carbon neutral, so they're by nature low carbon. But actually, our TWG think, and a lot of research has shown that energy asset project, they actually have greenhouse gas emissions over their life cycle, from the conversion and management, feedstock production, transport and distribution, and the final energy production process. In addition to that, bioenergy facilities can also lead to reduction in carbon sequestration and indirect land use change, which can lead to further greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, I think it is important to set up a specific greenhouse gas emission threshold for bioenergy assets and facilities in order for this sector to deliver sufficient emission reductions. Mitigation requirement, we actually have three sub requirements. The first requirement is a specific greenhouse gas emission threshold for different facilities. So you can see we have 5 categories of different facilities, and they will have different thresholds. Our threshold is based on the principle that bioenergy projects need to achieve 80% in reduction compared to fossil fuel baseline, and the fossil fuel baseline is based on the EU RED II proposal, which you can find in our background paper and on the website as well. And under this greenhouse gas emission threshold, issuers are required to conduct life cycle assessments of the greenhouse gas emission from their facilities and meet this specific threshold. So for facilities producing biofuel and biomass, for electricity production, for example, they need to meet the emission threshold of 36.6 grams CO2e per mil. And it applies to facilities producing liquid biofuel and biomass for heating and cogeneration, and for producing biofuel for transport. The number is a bit different, but the principle is the same. And electricity facilities using biofuel and biomass will actually have a different threshold. So you can see from this table the 100 grams CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. So the number is based on our research and climate modeling, and this is how CBI define low carbon power. So you can find this same threshold in our other sector criteria, including geothermal criteria and the upcoming hydropower criteria. So that's how we define low carbon electricity. That's why we require bioenergy facilities to use electricity facilities using biofuel and biomass to meet this threshold. And for heating, cooling, and cogeneration facilities using biofuel and biomass, in addition to the threshold for biofuel and biomass produced, we, in order to ensure the biomass is in good use, the TWG has put another threshold, energy efficiency threshold 80%, based on the best practice industry to ensure the output heating and cooling can deliver low carbon effect. First, greenhouse gas emissions threshold, the first requirement under the mitigation requirement. Requirement is about assessing the risk of carbon stock reduction. So for woody biomass, the demand, if the woody biomass is used for bioenergy, there's a risk that the feedstock source, their carbon sequestration might be changed, it might be reduced or might be increased. So this requirement is to make sure the risk of carbon sequestration reduction can be reduced. And this is on the sustainability requirements for solid biomass in Netherlands. So, under this requirement, issuers, they are required to identify the source of the feedstock, and they need to provide a forest management plan to make sure and to demonstrate that the forest management unit where the feedstock, i.e. the wood, is sourced is managed with aim of retaining or increasing carbon stock in the medium or long term. So the medium or long term will depend on the nature of the feedstock source and the nature of the forest. And the third requirement under the mitigation requirement is about reducing the risk of indirect land use impact. So there's some concerns about this. So indirect land use impact ILUC occurs when production of biomass in one place might lead to change land use in another place. It's a bit complicated, but there's some concerns about this. So in order to address this issue, we require bioenergy facilities to either get certified under the RSB low carbon, low indirect land use transitional module, or these facilities need to provide evidence and documentation to demonstrate they actually meet the requirements under this ILUC option module. So there are 3 indicators under the RSB module, include yield increase, unused degraded land, and use of waste residues. So each can demonstrate that the feedstock is from increase of yield, or from unused degraded land, or from the waste and the residues. They can demonstrate they actually have low risks of indirect land use impact. So that are 3 requirements under the mitigation requirements of our bioenergy criteria. The second main requirement is adaptation and resilience requirement. So the requirement is to make sure energy production they're resilient to the future climate change, and they are not creating negative impacts on the ecosystem that lead to the reduce of the resilience of the surrounding ecosystem. So I think it is quite important to set up requirements to ensure the bioenergy is being used in such a way. There are 2 sub-requirements under this adaptation and resilient requirement. So the first one is a checklist. We call it Adaptation Resilience Checklist. If you're familiar with our other sector criteria, you can actually find it in there too. So like geothermal or hydro and water, we all have this adaptation resilience checklist. So under this checklist, the issuer they need to identify the climate-related risks and the vulnerabilities to the asset and the site where the project is operated. Then the issuer also needs to identify the impacts in a larger context beyond the asset and site. And then third step is that issuer needs to design and implement strategies to mitigate and adapt these climate risks and the vulnerabilities they identified during step 1 and 2. The requirement is to make sure the bioenergy facility themselves they're resilient to existing and future climate change risks. And the second under the adaptation resilience requirements is to make sure the feedstock, the biofacility they are being used is resilient to climate change. So this risk requirement ensures feedstock needs to be certified under approved best practice standards. There are actually 2 options under this requirement. The first option, like I just said, the feedstocks are certified under one of the pre-approved best practice standards, including RSB, RCRS, FSC, ISCC+. So those standards, the TBG has done a thorough review of these standards and compared to other standards as well. Actually, I think in total, the whole group has reviewed 19 best practice standards. And we think this 4 standard is most robust one in the market right now. But there are also a possibility for issuers to use other standards. That's what this option B. So under option B, issuer can actually choose another standard they want to use. So they need to make evaluation of the robustness of the standards they proposed and provide evidence and analysis to the technical working group. The technical working group will decide whether these newly proposed standards are sufficient or not. If so, then issuer can use this proposed standards and demonstrate that they meet the best practice standards and their feedstock production are environmentally sustainable. Requirement 2 under the Adaptation and Resilience Requirement. Number requirements, we actually have a reporting requirement, but this is a more general requirement under our standards V2.1 and the upcoming standards V3, as Ujala has introduced. Those standards V2.1 is about the process, about the management of proceeds, and about the verification of the projects and the bonds themselves. So this reporting requirement is based on the mitigation requirement and the adaptation and the resilience requirement I've just go through with you. So basically, issuers need to provide documents, information, and evidence to show that they actually meet the requirements of the criteria. Then the approval verifier will check the information. In addition to that, because there's a lot of interest from investors about transparency of the green bonds and the underlying assets and projects. So issuers of certified bonds, they're encouraged to publicly disclose the information such as the project size, project location, lifetime of the project, and they want to specify that the food security risks. So I think there's concern about the option of biomass might lead to food security issues because they are basically competing with food security. So under our criteria, we are actually encouraging issuers to disclose such information. For example, they can evaluate food security at a national level by checking the International Food Policy and Research Institute's Global Hunger Index. And if they identify they might have, if identified they are in the food insecurity, they can assess whether their operations are likely to have impact on the food security locally or not. If so, and issuers are encouraged to make plans to address these issues. So that's our way to address food security. That's all for the details of the bioenergy criteria. So now over to you, Sergio.
Lily and Ujala for walking us through the bioenergy criteria. That was very interesting. We're now going to open up for questions, and we already had a few coming in. But just as a reminder for our listeners, to submit a question, use the Q&A panel at the top right-hand corner in the webinar platform. If you're filling in, you can submit questions by emailing them to lily@climatebond.net. So the first question that came in, do issuers need to meet both mitigation and adaptation and resilience requirements?
Yes. So on our bioenergy criteria, actually other sector criteria as well. Both the mitigation requirements and adaptation requirements, issuers they need to meet them. So the goal of our standards is to identify assets and projects that can deliver a low carbon and climate resilient economy. So both the low carbon and climate resilience are important in our criteria. So issuers are required to meet both of the requirements. If they do one of them, they are not eligible for the certification.
Thank you for clarification. The second question, are forestry projects included in the bioenergy criteria?
Actually, no. So the production of bioenergy feedstock, such as energy crops, involves the use of land. So, uh, so the assets of feedstock producers are the lands they're using and associated machinery and infrastructure for that cultivation. So the production of bioenergy feedstock using land will actually cover under the forestry and agriculture criteria, which apply to land use and land management, including production of food, feed, and fiber, etc. But we do require life cycle assessments of energy projects. So the calculation of the greenhouse gas emissions will include emissions from feedstock production.
Are biodegradable municipal solid waste, also known as MSW, included in the bioenergy criteria?
Because we have other sector criteria to cover MSW. So, for example, the sewage sludge will be covered under our water infrastructure criteria. So, under water infrastructure criteria, which covers most of the water infrastructure, including nature-based water infrastructure, the requirement, they also have two requirements, both mitigation and adaptation resilience. So, for mitigation, the criteria requires that there's no no net positive greenhouse emissions from water infrastructure. And for adaptation and resilience requirements, there's quite a checklist for users to use to check their water infrastructure is resilient to future climate change and that they have adaptation plan in place. And the food waste will be covered under waste management criteria. I think we might have different approach under the waste management criteria. Is that clarify how we address food waste at a bit too early stage?
Can you just repeat that?
How we address food waste under the waste management criteria?
Yes. So the waste management criteria is still under development, but food waste would be covered under that criteria, as the criteria will cover composting as well as anaerobic digestion. So we expect food waste to be covered within those categories of assets under criteria.
Okay, thank you. Another question, what are the requirements for biorefinery facilities in this criteria?
Yeah, so it's a bit complicated about our approach to biorefinery facilities. So for your information, biorefinery facilities, they use both biology-based products for power and heat and biomass-based materials and products for non-energy use, such as food and feed ingredients, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and materials, etc. So they are potentially eligible for certification under the criteria. So we need to separate dedicated and non-dedicated biorefinery facilities. And our approach is to separate them based on the percentage of the biomaterial for energy use produced from biorefinery facilities. So facilities producing less than 50% of the materials for energy use will not be eligible under the current iteration of the criteria. This is because of some changes to determine appropriate eligibility criteria and find appropriate benchmark for such projects and facilities. However, for facilities producing equal to or more than 50% of the biomaterial for energy use, they will be eligible under energy criteria, but also need to meet the mitigation and adaptation resilience requirements. So for adaptation resilience requirements, the whole facility needs to meet the requirement 1 checklist and the requirement 2 feedstock certified under pre-approved best practice standards. But for mitigation we will only require the biomaterial for energy use, that part, to meet the mitigation emission threshold. So if the biorefinery facilities have multiple products, including non-bioenergy and bioenergy, then they need to allocate the emission to bioenergy products based on energy content. And the bioenergy products meet the greenhouse gas emission threshold we just go through. For non-bioenergy products, there's currently no requirements for them. Hope it makes sense.
Yes, it does. A very interesting question. Why traditional biomass assets or projects such as three-stone fire for heating and cooking in the residential sector are not covered by the criteria?
Yeah, so just like I've said before, the traditional biomass, they actually have very low conversion efficiency. I think normally it's 10 to 20%. And because the combustion is not efficient, they can lead to harmful emissions with serious health implications. Also, another practical reason, the traditional biomass represents no or very little relevance to financial bonds. So that's why we the bioenergy criteria is not covering traditional biomass. I think there's also discussion from like IEA Bioenergy. They are currently supporting modern biomass compared to traditional biomass. The reasons we've just described.
For a minute again, you said something about modeling exercises for greenhouse gas emissions. So how did the technical working group decide these greenhouse gas emission thresholds?
Yes, so there's a couple of considerations we have. So for the bioenergy feedstock, the TBG thinks should go beyond the regulations. So current EU RED regulation, they require bioenergy feedstock to achieve 60 to 70% emission reduction. So TBG think we can go further. So we require each to achieve 80%. And actually, we have done some analysis on the implications of this threshold as well. So, well, more details you can see in the background paper. There's a big table about typical value of greenhouse gas emissions from different bioenergy feedstock. And when we check our thresholds, I think most of the feedstock can meet our threshold, and some of the feedstock they can actually achieve 90% emission reduction compared to fossil fuel baseline. And for bioenergy facilities that are using bioenergy producing electricity, heating, and cooling, the goal is to achieve 2-degree global warming targets. And so for the electricity, we are using this 100 grams CO2e per kilowatt hour. This is based on the research and the modeling. Under 2 degree, low carbon power needs to meet this threshold. But for heating and cooling facilities, it's quite hard to find a benchmark about the energy output. And there's currently no research or modeling to indicate a uniform threshold for heating and cooling. Therefore, for heating and cooling facilities, in addition to the threshold for bioenergy feedstock, we have added another threshold, energy efficiency threshold of 80%. This is to make sure the whole facilities and the energy output for heating and cooling can be sufficient to deliver low carbon economy. You can see more details of the discussion in that front paper, which you can find on our website.
Would you be able to mention or describe very briefly what kind of tools are used to calculate these greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes. So at the moment, we have approved grades 1 and 2, an RE greenhouse gas calculator, UK solid and gaseous biomass carbon calculator, and grades. So these tools, they are required to use one of them. But of course, there's also an exception. So if the tools are not applicable to the issuer can choose and put another tool they're using or they want to use, and then they need to submit information about this tool, including the methodologies, sums, and the calculation process under this tool. And this information will be submitted to the Bioenergy Technical Working Group. And if the Technical Working Group thinks this tool is sufficient and robust, then the issuer can use this tool to calculate greenhouse gas emissions and to demonstrate they actually meet our mitigation requirements.
We have another question from the public. What evidence would we expect issuers to provide to verifiers to prove compliance with these criteria?
Yes, I think you can actually check the reporting requirement. So issuer needs to provide documents and information based on the reporting requirement, and also to demonstrate they actually meet the mitigation requirement and adaptation resilience requirements. In terms of specific documents, we didn't specify any documents you can should provide, as long as the information is sufficient for verifiers to check. I think, and is sufficient to demonstrate that you actually meet our requirements. That's fine. You can also find some details in the standard V2.1 and V3 to see there's some guidance for verifiers, and we also have guidance for verifiers on our website.
We have a very popular question coming ahead. What if a bond has a mixture of assets and projects, including portfolio, not only limited to bioenergy assets? Can you still
Yeah, that's quite a common question, and that's quite common for large financial institutions like banks, because they have a large portfolio with mixed assets and projects. So if the bond has a mixed assets and projects, different types of assets and projects, they need to meet different sector criteria. So, for example, their bioenergy assets need to meet our energy criteria. Their maybe water assets need to meet water criteria, and same applies to other types of assets as well. So at the moment, I think we have 11 sector criteria available for the market to use. But if the bond has assets that we don't have a criteria available for them to use, then those assets we cannot certify. So in this case, issuers are encouraged to separate their assets. So the assets eligible for criteria and the criteria are available to use, those assets we can certify. For assets that don't meet criteria or the criteria are not available, then we can't certify those assets. Buying asset projects, of course, issuers still needs to meet other requirements, such as the establish of green bond issuance framework, amendment of proceeds, reporting, and external review, etc.
We have another general question, also quite popular. What are the challenges of developing green bond market, and what are your recommendations?
I think the biggest challenge is the lack of awareness of what is green. So a lot of issuers, they may already have green assets like electric vehicles, but they didn't realize they can actually issue a green bond against those assets. Therefore, it's quite important to have a guidance on what is green assets and projects in the market. I think that's the goal of our standards and certification scheme as well. So, well, recommendation will be more workshop and market education for issuers, investors, and other market participants about what is green. So we have our, like Ujala has introduced, climate bonds taxonomy, which provide guidelines on what green assets and projects under different sectors. I think EU high-level green sustainable finance, they also have their EU sustainable taxonomy. I think it's currently under development about what is green, and they are trying to link the SDGs into their framework. Other countries like China, they also have their own green definitions. It's called China Green Bond Endorsed Project Catalog. I think India, EU, and ASEAN, they also have their guidance and official guidelines on green definitions. So policy development of green definitions, but I think more education on the market side for users, for investors, for underwriters, and credit rating agencies, etc., are needed in the market.
Thank you, Lily. I think this is our last question. So what kind of feedback are you expecting from the market once this criteria is formally finalized and released?
Oh, that's a simple question. Actually, I think whether you're an issuer or verifier or investor, it would be great to get your feedback on the feasibility of the criteria. So whether it's too strict or too loose for you to use, whether it's practical for you to, for example, buyers to make all these assessments, and whether it's practical for issuers to provide such information. I mean, if you have a large portfolio, it might be quite a work for them to disclose information. So this kind of feedback, so from an investor's point of view, whether these criteria are sufficient to ensure the assets and projects you are investing in are green enough for you to invest or not. So those are the kind of feedbacks we're expecting from all market participants.
Thank you, Lily. I think this brings us to the end of this webinar. It's been a very interesting conversation with all of you, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Many thanks for attending, and thank you, Joel, again, and Lily, for the introduction to the bioenergy criteria. Please know that public consultation closes on the 1st of July 2018. So if you have any further thoughts, feedback, or questions, please send them to Lily at lily@climatebonds.net. We'll take a recording of this webinar online, and we'll email around the link. If anyone that would be interested but could not attend today, please do share the links. And so for now, thank you and goodbye.